So tell us a little bit about the history of the actual seismograph. How long has it been at Tech and operational?
Well, it was installed in 1963. It was part of what was at the time known as the Worldwide Standardized Seismic Network. And it was put in primarily by the Air Force. It was part of this network, a global network of seismographs, mainly to record underground nuclear testing. This was right after the ratification, I guess, of the test ban treaty, and that put all nuclear testing underground. And so one of the ways to monitor that is with seismographs. So that was the main motivation for it. But in doing that, then they really increased the capability of seismology on a global basis, and it really ultimately led to the development of the theory of plate tectonics. So it's a very significant development in geosciences. And it's been here since it was installed in 1963 and just in time to record the 1964 Alaska earthquake.
No, and you brought up that one. That was, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, that was one of the more powerful earthquakes on record, correct?
Yeah, that is. That's one of the 10 top earthquakes in the 20th century.
It was like a nine, wasn't it?
It was a magnitude 9.2, actually. Yeah.
Okay. So I guess, you mentioned that it's a very, very sensitive thing. It's always recording, it's always getting information, it's always measuring shaking. Um, you brought up the Alaska earthquake. Um, how common is it if there's an earthquake in somewhere like California? Is the tech seismograph going to pick that up, or is that too far away?
No, it'll record. It depends on the magnitude of the earthquake. This instrument is capable of recording a magnitude 5 earthquake anywhere on Earth. We'll record something. So any earthquake bigger than a magnitude 5 is going to show up. A big earthquake like a magnitude 7, that's easily recorded. I mean, the record lasts for hours after an earthquake that size.
So when you're looking at a seismograph readout, if any earthquake is in the world is going to be recorded at a 5 or higher, it's going to show up on there. When someone looks at a seismograph, I guess maybe give us the really quick and dirty kind of lesson in how you read a seismograph to where you can tell, okay, this one was a close by quake.
Well, it depends on, the smaller the earthquake, the closer it has to be to the seismograph to be recorded above the background noise. The ground is always moving, so it's never absolutely still. And these instruments will actually record that ambient background noise. And so the detection capability depends on two things: how big the earthquake is and how far away it is from the instrument. So we can see a magnitude 5 earthquake just about anywhere on Earth if the background noise is not extraordinarily high. But we can also see much smaller earthquakes if they're close to the station. So a magnitude 2 earthquake anywhere in Virginia or North Carolina or West Virginia, we'll record that. You get down to a magnitude 1, you're talking about having to be within a few 50 kilometers or less. Uh, Minus magnitudes, the magnitude scale is it open-ended. It works from minus numbers to plus numbers, and each unit number is a 10 times increase in size, amplitude of the ground motion. So things like the earthquake in Buckingham County yesterday, that's a magnitude 3 earthquake, more or less, and that's easily recorded at the station. We could see that sized earthquake if it were in, say, Western Tennessee, for example. But a smaller event like a magnitude 0 or 1, it has to be pretty close by. And in the case of the crowd noise at the stadium, that's only about a mile away. So we see that easily.
Okay. Uh, One thing that I did want to touch on is, and we kind of talked about this yesterday, Virginia earthquakes aren't as uncommon as people might think. If you want to kind of touch on why that is, why, I think it's the fact that just because we don't feel them doesn't mean that they don't occur. And occasionally we do get those that you can feel. You want to kind of touch on a little bit about Virginia seismology because I think that's kind of for lack of a better word, kind of an under talked about topic.
Okay, yeah, I can certainly talk about that. It turns out that we have earthquakes all over eastern North America. It's not just a West Coast thing, of course. Um, and even though we're a long way from the active plate boundaries, which is North America, that's in along the West Coast, we're actually in the middle of the North American tectonic plate here. But the stresses from the plate motion are just as high here as they are in California. The only difference is that the strain rates, the rates at which the crown deforms, which is mainly by earthquakes, is a much higher rate in, say, California than it is here in Virginia. So we can have big earthquakes in this part of the country. In fact, we have had magnitude almost 8, if not maybe a little bit bigger earthquakes in the Mississippi Valley back in the 1811-12 sequence. They call it the New Madrid earthquakes. And we've had a magnitude 7 earthquake in near Charleston, South Carolina, back in 1886. We've had 2 magnitude 5 or bigger earthquakes in Virginia. The first one was in 1897. Actually, we may have had one in 1875 as a magnitude 5. It was right on the border. The Giles County earthquake in 1897 was certainly about a magnitude 5.5. And then we had the Mineral earthquake, which is probably the biggest one in the state, certainly one in historical time. That was a 5.7 in August of 2011, caused damage all over the place out in eastern central Virginia and up into Washington area and Baltimore and so forth. So yeah, we have earthquakes all over the country. Virginia has actually more than its share. We've got 2 areas in Virginia that that are recognized as seismic zones. One of them is in central Virginia. That's known to seismologists as the Central Virginia Seismic Zone. And then there's another area out here along the New River Valley. Um, it's referred to as the Giles County Seismic Zone, and that's also been a location for some earthquakes in the 19th century and in 20th too. Other places are in eastern Tennessee and down in South Carolina, and then up in New England. And eastern Canada has a lot of earthquakes. So we're kind of above average for just an arbitrary spot east of the Rocky Mountains. Virginia has more earthquakes than average. And they're usually occurring in the Central Virginia seismic zone or around here in Giles County.
And I think the reason why kind of nobody knows that is because they're relatively
They're
lower
small.
grade,
They're
correct?
small earthquakes. Most of these things are only recorded. The only people that know about it are people like me that look at seismograms. And but occasionally, like twice on year, about twice, maybe 3 times, there'll be a small earthquake somewhere in Virginia that a few people will feel. And of course, the most recent one was here just yesterday, actually, near Dillon.
Okay. When you actually brought up, I was going to talk about the new Madrid zone and also the Charleston zone. Um, a lot of seismologists think that, we're due for a big quake along the Mississippi, along that the new Madrid zone. Why is that?
Well, it's hard to say, predict when earthquakes occur anywhere. I mean, even in areas like in Southern California, where most of the main faults are well known, mapped, and have been studied extensively. In the eastern part of the country, we don't really have the advantage actually of being able to do a lot of geologic work on the faults because the earthquakes that occur mainly occur on faults that we don't even know about. And in they're there, they're not obvious. The faults that are mapped, most of the faults on geologic maps in the eastern part of the country are Paleozoic faults. They're hundreds of millions of years old since they've been active. And they've been dead more ever since. There's a few younger faults of Mesozoic age, but again, most of those are not active, obviously associated with the earthquakes. The earthquakes are occurring apparently on minor faults, probably of Mesozoic or younger age, and they don't have a lot of displacement on them. So the ground is not deformed. We don't have like fault scarps, or we don't have anything in the topography to tell us where these earthquakes are, except just a couple of examples. And so, yeah, the basis for the predictions or the forecast for earthquakes in New Madrid is based on prehistoric earthquakes. There's a record of liquefaction and things that disturbances of the ground are recorded in the geologic record that can be carbon dated. And we know that there have been major earthquakes in that part of the United States, in the central Mississippi Valley there, on several occasions, 4 or 5 of these major earthquakes in the last few thousand years. And so we use that to estimate the strain rate and the occurrence rates of the big earthquakes. And we can do that out in the Mississippi Valley, and we can also do it down in Charleston, in that area around Summerville, South Carolina. There have been prehistoric earthquakes in that area too that we know about. So those are the two areas where we know that we've got active seismic zones. And on the basis of just assuming that the seismicity rates are the same as what we determined from the paleoliquefaction evidence, then we can say something about the probability of an earthquake in the future.
Okay. If you could also kind of explain the two types of earthquakes. I know that one is caused when the plates kind of move and slide up against each other
Yeah.
or rub up against each other, and the other is when they go over top of each other. If you could kind of go into just a little bit of a detail about that.
Well, what you were describing there is the sort of what we refer to as the focal mechanism of the earthquake. Earthquakes are always 90% earthquakes are due to slippage on faults. And the orientation of the fault determines the nature of the ground motion. So if you have a fault plane like this, and it's being compressed or stressed horizontally, what will happen is one side will move up with respect to the other, and that's called a reverse fault. In some other tectonic environments, like out in the Great Basin, the stress field is the opposite of that. It's an extension. So when that happens, the hanging wall, the upper block of rock, moves down with respect to the footwall. So those are two types of mechanisms that are just due to the orientation of the stress field. The other possibility or end member of that is when the fault is vertical and you've got a kind of an intermediate stress where you have two of the principal stresses are one's vertical, the other is horizontal. Then you get this kind of motion, just pure sideways motion on a vertical fault. That's called strike slip. And that's the case with, say, the San Andreas Fault in California. In that case, the opposite side moves to the right with respect to the side that you're looking at or that you're standing on. So that's just a stress orientation determination there. They're all caused by far field stresses that are generated due to plate motions.
So the earthquake that occurred yesterday in Buckingham, that was an overtop or an underneath,
That's
right?
probably a case where one side is moved up with respect to the other.
Okay.
Most of the earthquakes out in central Virginia have reverse mechanisms. So one side goes up with respect to the other.
Okay. Um, so let's go back and talk about the inner Sandman effect, we'll call it, on the seismograph. Well, first of all, how valuable of a resource is it for tech to have a working seismograph for the School of Geosciences?
It's really important. It allows us to teach, hands-on work with their students, and it's been a source of data that I've used for my whole career. I use data from the station's call letters are BLA, just for Blacksburg. That's what it's been for since the 1960s. And it's one station out of there's several other stations that are operating in the Virginia region right now. But to do good seismology, you have to have multiple seismographs. So you need to have a number of them around, kind of surrounding the epicenter of the earthquake to do such things as just locate the epicenter and the focal depth. It's really hard to determine the focal depth if you don't have several stations nearby. And then also, in order to distinguish between, say, strike slip motion or reverse motion or normal type motion on the fault plane, you've also got to have a network of stations around. So it takes quite a few of these things to actually be able to learn much about the earthquakes. And so BLA has been contributing to that for decades now. And that station, along with some others, that's the basis for the data that seismologists like myself use to try to understand why we have earthquakes here in this part of the country. And then on top of that, we really want to know how much the ground is going to move when an earthquake occurs. And we've learned that eastern earthquakes in, say, Virginia or other parts of eastern North America, they shake the ground much, much stronger at larger distances than they do in California. You have two earthquakes of the same magnitude, one in Virginia, say one in Southern California, and if you're 50 kilometers from the site, from the epicenter, the ground in Virginia shakes a lot stronger than it does in California. And that's just due to the geology and the deformation rates that take place in California. The waves attenuate a lot faster there. The energy is absorbed as the wave energy travels. It decreases due to frictional loss, and that occurs at a much higher rate in California than it does out here in the eastern part of the country, where the rocks are old and strong and cold. They transmit that seismic energy very well. So that's another thing we try to understand and get a handle on. We have to develop ground motion prediction models to be able to assess the hazard here in the East. And it's different than in California due to the difference in attenuation.
And I assume that it being so close to the Giles County zone is also a very, very, well-placed seismograph, for lack of a
Yeah,
better.
it's fortunately recorded a lot of earthquakes over in that area. And so we know now a lot more about that place than we did or would have known if we didn't have that station here. It's the same for other places in the Southern Appalachians. BLA is, for years and years, was the only station actually operating in this region. And as a result of that, we have a catalog of earthquakes where we have good magnitude estimates and we have good locations. And it's BLA has been a big contributor to that. If you took the station away, you take away half the catalog of earthquakes in the Southern Appalachians.
So, with Metallica coming in tonight, a lot of people obviously are hearing about the inner Sandman effect. Um, that we accomplished already that it's recording all the time. What is the typical when they play Inner Sandman to start off the game and all the kids are jumping up and down? What does the seismograph typically register with that? I assume it varies with every game, but what's it on the typical register on that?
Well, I can actually show you an example if I could share my screen.
Sure, sure, by all means.
Do that. I can show, I think I can find it here. Hopefully, I won't promise it, but I'll try. So you have to turn on the screen share for me.
Okay. Let's see. Okay.
All right. Let's see what I can do here. Okay, can you see that seismogram there?
I can. Yep.
Okay, that's the actual recording of at the beginning of the football game. This was back in November of 2019. I think we were playing Wake Forest. And like every seismogram, what you have is a record of ground motion. The wiggle trace, that black line is the ground moving. And it's being amplified maybe 100,000 times. So what you see on the screen here, that you divide that by 100,000, and that's about the size, the amplitude of the ground motion. And the time scale down here on the bottom is that's in seconds. So that's 20 seconds, 40 seconds, 60 seconds. And so what you're seeing on the upper trace, that's the ground as it moves to east and west. We use three component seismographs so that you can actually get a vector description of the ground motion in three dimensions. So that's east-west. The ground goes, when the trace goes up, the ground's moving to the east. Here's the north-south component, and you see it's a lot bigger than the east-west horizontal. And this is the vertical. So what this is telling us is that the ground motion is a lot bigger in the vertical and radial or north-south directions. Well, Lane Stadium happens to be due north of the seismic station. So what's going on here is that we're seeing surface waves from the people in the stands moving in sync with the music. And if you expand that trace out, you find out that the peaks, some of those peaks you can kind of resolve. The time between those peaks is half a second. That's 2 hertz, 2 cycles per second. On a metronome, that's 120 beats per minute. So that's the drummer's tempo for Enter Sandman. And the people in the stands are going up and down, and they're putting a lot of energy into the ground and creating these Rayleigh waves, surface waves. The total, if you integrated all the energy in that signal, it would be about a magnitude 1.5 earthquake. It's spread out over a lot of time. So it's not, if it was a magnitude 1.5 earthquake, the energy would be, the seismogram would only last a few seconds, but the amplitude would be a lot bigger, great big. Here it's spread out in time, so the energy, there's quite a bit of energy going into the ground, but it's spread out over a long time. And so that's very different than with an earthquake, which happens very fast. Here it's lasting 2 minutes or even longer. So that's what that record looks like. I can show you a real earthquake.
Yeah, sure.
Uh, I have to unstop sharing that one and try it again here on another one. Okay, that's the earthquake yesterday out in near Dillon in Buckingham County. And so what you see now, here's a time scale again. That's 50 seconds right there from here to here. And this is the BLA station. This is Blacksburg. This station is in Charlottesville, actually. So it's closer to the epicenter. So the motion starts sooner here. In Blacksburg, same three components. That's the east, west, north, south, and the vertical. And now you see that the amplitude gets a lot bigger real quick, and then it decays real fast. See, that's different than what we were seeing with the crowd noise. And the amplitudes are actually about the same here. In other words, Enter Sandman, the crowd noise is about as big in Blacksburg as the amplitude of the ground motion from that earthquake in Dillon. So it's that kind of a trade-off, distance versus magnitude here. And so you see other phases. You see there are two kinds of waves that go through the body of the Earth. One is like a sound wave, and that is the fastest, and that's called the P wave. That's this. And then later on, you see the Rayleigh waves and the shear waves. This is what we were seeing from Lane Stadium. The waves are right in this part of the seismogram. They travel slower than the P wave. So as the waves travel, they separate out in time. Here, they're coming in nearly at the same time at Charlottesville because it's a lot closer. But that part of the seismogram there, that's comparable to what we were seeing from the crowd noise. It's generated by the vertical radial motion of the surface wave.
That's fascinating. That's a great example. So essentially, and just to make sure that I understand correctly, the earthquake yesterday on the seismogram, at least in Blacksburg, basically felt like a home football game at Lane Stadium.
That's right. I mean, the ground moved about the same amplitude from that earthquake in Buckingham County. I don't know how many kilometers that away. That's 150 kilometers away, probably. And a mile away or about 1.5 kilometers away in Blacksburg from the crowd. See, so the earthquake is a lot bigger, a lot more energy going into the ground in a much smaller time interval. So that's what causes the amplitudes to be about the same, but when you compensate for the distances, difference in distance.
That's fascinating. That is really fascinating. So, what do we expect tonight? How What do we expect the seismograph to look like tonight with a whole Metallica concert going on?
Well, it depends on what the crowd does. If they don't get fired up, it may not do much. But I anticipate they probably will be fired up, and so we'll certainly see something very similar to what we see when they play the recording at the beginning of the football game when they play Enter Sandman. I'm curious to see if the band plays at the same tempo they do on that recording. I probably expect they will. It's about 120 on a metronome. Um, and then they're playing a lot of other tunes, and so I guess it'll be much more spread out. We'll see an hour's worth of this rather than just 2 minutes or whatever.
Can you unshare the screen just so when the recording happens, it gets your face on there and say that again for us?
Well, I'm expecting to see something similar to the football game recordings. That's the crowd response to a recording. When the band actually plays tonight, they'll probably play Inner Sandman, maybe at the same tempo, maybe not. We'll know. I mean, we'll be able to determine that from the seismograph. And then they'll be playing multiple tunes too, so there'll probably be a lot longer record. We'll see more and more crowd noise spread out over an hour or however long they play.
So when you come in tomorrow and you look at the seismogram from the night before, what are you expecting to see?
I'm expecting to see a lot of crowd noise on there, just like we do, for a football game. Uh, the crowd's going to be bigger. They're going to have a lot more people. They'll be on the field. I think the energy gets put into the ground mainly through the foundation of the stadium, so that could be about the same. Uh, but it'll probably be real well recorded. We'll know something's going on.